So when you're performing the bend and lift screen, generally all you might need is simple devices like 2 balls, maybe 2 PVC dowels. And the idea is you're going to give enough information so they understand how to perform the screen, but not enough to coach them how to do it correctly. When a person has a compensation or a movement limitation, generally what ends up happening is they either borrow from an adjacent segment or they generally move into a different plane. A classic example is on this movement. Understand that a bend and lift pattern is exclusively in the sagittal plane. Everything is moving forward and backwards as we go up and down, right? Well, if I decide that I can't get my hands to the floor, right, I always find a way to get it done. Some of the ways we see is a person goes down and they just tend to flex their trunk forward and maybe round their spine out. Another way could be, well, if I open up my feet wider, then I don't need my tibia to translate forward. Watch my tibia, when I bring my feet pretty close together, watch how much forward movement is needed of my tibia to translate forward to allow me to get my hands to the floor. I don't have that capacity because I have a limitation in my ankle. Compensation might be to go wider, so the compensation to this plane allows me to get deeper without having to get as much tibial translation. But now that changes the forces in the knee. So while you may get away with less ankle mobility, it puts a lot more force in the knee because you're changing the vectors here. The loading at the knee is supposed to be like that, you're creating more of that. All right? So I always look at place the balls down, I'll say put them down and watch how a person places them down. If they place them relatively close like this, I'm impressed. A lot of times you might see this. Kind of put it there because they're going to come in like this and kind of go to a wide stance. And in my mind, I've made my first observation. Might be compensation going on here. But nonetheless, let's go into this. Now, in a perfect world, I would be wearing shorts, or I'd have my pants rolled up and I'd have my shoes off because I can really see what's happening at the feet. We want to actually take 2 planes of view here. We want to look at the person directly front on, and we want to have a bit of a view from the side, because from the front, I'm looking at 3 basic compensations, or 3 sections where compensations typically happen, and from the side, I'm looking at 4. So I need 7 really repetitions at least to be able to tell me or get enough information to be able to make some sort of determination as to what I'm seeing and I like and what I'm seeing and I don't like. So, first observation, we're just going to simply look at the inside of the feet, so you're down here. Because what's going to happen is as you drop down, the tibia has to translate. And I want to use an analogy here. Think of a horse, a rider, and a saddle. Think of your heel bone, your calcaneus, as the horse. Think of the talus bone as the saddle, and think of the tibia as the rider. Generally, if you watch a horse riding across a movie screen from left to right, what you're seeing is the rider is moving forward and backwards in the saddle as the horse is galloping. That's basically the articulation between the rider and the saddle. It's called the talocrural joint, or true ankle joint. And that's what controls or allows for dorsiflexion and plantarflexion. What we need in this bend and lift is a lot of dorsiflexion. In fact, I didn't tie the straps very tight on the belly of the horse. That saddle might slip around the belly of the horse. Let's call that pronation, supination, just to keep it simple, right? And that might be what I see. If I don't have the movement in the talocrural joint, the closest thing to me is just to get the subtalar joint, which is the joint between the talus and the calcaneus, to give me some movement. And typically what you see with a lot of people is the talus will fall in, and if the talus falls in, my foot pronates, which means as I'm looking at the inside of your foot, I watch this bone, it just collapses in. Now, there's ways you can do it, where you can kind of palpate and you can kind of feel the talus bone move. A little difficult to show here on the video, all right? But for the most part, we just want to note for any visible collapsing of the feet. It may be subtle, it may be towards the lowest part of the squat, and it might also be asymmetrical between the limbs, right? So, we get back up to our position, we're going to cue the person that these are heavy. In other words, don't pick them up like that. Pretend they're 2 50-pound kettlebells. Generally, we want to do the movement screen unloaded. And let's just see how they go about it. So my first repetition is strictly straight on from the front. As they go down a pick, watch the feet. We want to see any evidence of this happen. So we're here, they go down, there's good stable foot position. This would be something that we don't want to see where the feet start to collapse in. So that's the first thing I'm looking for. The second repetition, or when I'm satisfied with that, move up, and now I'm looking at the knees. Because if you think about it, if your ankles collapse in, the knees will follow. So typically, if you watch what's happening here, as my ankles collapse, my knees collapse. So a lot of times we make the assumption, if the knees collapse, you must have an ankle mobility issue. It's not exactly true, because there might be something happening at the hip. Because as you are dropping into this position, you are actually lengthening these adductors right here. As you drop down, they're being lengthened. If they're tight, they may be pulling the knee in as well. So that knee collapsing in, that valgus stress on the knee, might be a limitation at the ankle, but could be a limitation at the hip. So how do we know the difference? Well, easy. You can repeat that movement, but elevate the heels. So use a plate, use any sort of riser, elevate the heels. Now you're taking the dorsiflexion requirement a little out of the equation, and let's see what happens. If the knees tend to align themselves, in other words, they stay pretty much aligned over the second toe, nice vertical alignment. Think of this as they're dropping down. We see that as opposed to that, or that, right? Then suffice it to say, with the heels elevated, if the knee's correct, the problem is more likely to be attributed to the ankle. But if the knees continue to collapse in, then it's a safe assumption to say, the problem is in the hips. So the second rep, we're looking at the position of the knees. And the third rep is pretty simple. Do we seem to keep the symmetry, or as we drop down, we seem to shift over a dominant leg?